The winter of discontent has arrived in Iran, and what began as scattered demonstrations over economic hardship has evolved into something far more profound. In the small city of Abdanan, nestled in the western reaches of Ilam province near the Iraqi border, an extraordinary event has unfolded that marks a potential turning point in the nation's ongoing crisis. On a day that would typically pass unremarked in this city of roughly 40,000 residents, protesters did not simply march through the streets demanding change. They seized control of the city itself. The images emerging from Abdanan tell a story that seems almost impossible in the context of the Islamic Republic's 4 decades of tightly maintained order. Video footage circulating across social media platforms shows large crowds of demonstrators moving freely through the city center, their voices unified in chants that declare a reality few could have imagined just weeks earlier. There are no security forces in the city, they proclaim, and the evidence before the cameras appears to confirm their words. The usual checkpoints stand unmanned. The government buildings that typically serve as symbols of state authority have been entered by citizens whose frustration has finally overcome their fear. What makes the situation in Abdanan particularly significant is not merely that protests occurred, but the manner in which control of the city changed hands. According to multiple reports filtering through social media channels and opposition sources, the police force withdrew without mounting significant resistance. Some accounts suggest officers simply abandoned their posts as the crowds grew larger and more determined. Others indicate that local security personnel, faced with overwhelming numbers and perhaps sharing some of the protesters' grievances, chose not to defend positions that had become indefensible. Government officials who remained in their offices found themselves confronted by citizens demanding accountability, and in some cases, these officials were reportedly detained by the protesters themselves. The path to this moment in Abdanan cannot be understood without examining the broader wave of unrest that has swept across Iran in recent weeks. The protests that erupted in late December were initially focused on economic concerns that had been building for months, if not years. The Iranian rial, the nation's currency, has experienced a devastating collapse in value, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary citizens and making basic goods increasingly unaffordable. Inflation rates have climbed to levels that strain credibility, with official figures significantly understating the real cost increases felt by families trying to feed themselves and maintain their households. These economic pressures did not emerge in a vacuum. They are the product of multiple factors converging simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of financial distress. International sanctions, reimposed and tightened over recent years, have severely restricted Iran's ability to sell oil on global markets and access international banking systems. The government's own economic policies, marked by mismanagement and corruption at various levels, have compounded these external pressures. State subsidies that once cushioned citizens from the worst effects of economic downturns have been reduced or eliminated, leaving vulnerable populations exposed to market forces they cannot withstand. When the first protests began, they centered on these bread and butter issues. Demonstrators took to the streets calling for relief from rising prices, demanding jobs, and expressing anger at an economic system that seemed designed to benefit a small elite while leaving everyone else to struggle. The chants were pragmatic, the demands concrete, but as security forces responded with arrests and in some cases violence, and as the government offered no meaningful solutions or acknowledgement of the people's pain, something fundamental shifted in the nature of the demonstrations. The economic grievances that sparked the initial protests quickly evolved into political demands that struck at the heart of the system itself. Protesters began calling not just for economic reforms, but for a reimagining of governance in Iran. The slogans grew bolder, challenging not merely specific policies, but the legitimacy of those implementing them. This transformation from economic protest to political uprising has historical precedent in Iran and across the region, but the speed and thoroughness of the shift in these current demonstrations has caught many observers by surprise. Abdanan's seizure by protesters represents the most dramatic manifestation of this escalation. The city lies in Ilam province, an area that has long been economically disadvantaged compared to Iran's major urban centers. The population here has dealt with high unemployment, limited infrastructure development, and a sense of neglect by central authorities in Tehran. These long-standing grievances provided fertile ground for protests to take root and spread rapidly once the nationwide demonstrations began. The geography of Abdanan itself plays a role in understanding how protesters were able to take control. The city is relatively compact, with government installations concentrated in an area that can be accessed and surrounded by large crowds. The distances involved are not vast, allowing protesters to move quickly between different strategic locations. The city's position near the border with Iraq also gives it a certain remoteness from the major population centers, where the regime's security apparatus is most concentrated and responsive. As news of Abdanan's fall spread across Iran, it sent shockwaves through both the protest movement and the government. For demonstrators in other cities, Abdanan became an inspiration, proof that determined citizens could achieve what had seemed impossible. The psychological impact of seeing an entire city slip from government control cannot be overstated. It shattered the illusion of the state's invincibility and suggested that the balance of power on the streets might not be as fixed as many had believed. For the Iranian government, Abdanan represented a crisis that demanded immediate response, but also posed difficult questions about how to proceed. The situation required careful handling, because the wrong move could either embolden protesters elsewhere or create martyrs that would fuel even greater unrest. The regime has spent decades perfecting techniques for managing and suppressing dissent, but those techniques have typically involved preventing situations like Abdanan from developing in the first place, not responding once they have already occurred. The broader context of protests across Iran provides essential background for understanding Abdanan's significance. Demonstrations have erupted in dozens of cities spanning the country's diverse regions and ethnic communities. In the capital, Tehran, large-scale confrontations between security forces and protesters have become almost routine. The bazaar districts that traditionally serve as economic and social barometers have seen shopkeepers close their businesses in solidarity with demonstrators. University campuses, long centers of political activism in Iran, have witnessed student protests that link current economic grievances with long-standing demands for greater social and political freedoms. The city of Mashhad, Iran's second largest and home to one of Shia Islam's holiest shrines, has seen particularly intense protests. The juxtaposition of religious devotion and political anger in Mashhad illustrates the complex dynamics at play across Iran. Many protesters are not rejecting faith or tradition, but rather demanding that those claiming religious authority demonstrate greater concern for the welfare of ordinary believers. The protests have also spread to cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, and Kermanshah, each bringing its own local grievances and characters to the nationwide movement. The government's response to the spreading protests has followed a familiar pattern of escalation and attempted containment. Security forces have made mass arrests, with reports indicating that over 990 people had been detained in just the first weeks of unrest. These arrests serve multiple purposes for the authorities. They remove active organizers and participants from the streets, creating gaps in protest networks and reducing coordination. They also send a message of deterrence to others who might consider joining demonstrations, reminding citizens of the personal costs that can come with dissent. But arrests alone have proven insufficient to quell the protests, and the regime has deployed other tools in its arsenal of control. Internet access has been severely restricted in many areas, with social media platforms blocked and connection speeds throttled to make it difficult to share videos and coordinate activities. State media has presented an alternative narrative of events, characterizing protesters as foreign-backed agents or criminals seeking to destabilize the nation. Government officials have blamed external enemies for the unrest, pointing to the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia as puppet masters supposedly pulling strings behind the scenes. These narratives ring increasingly hollow to many Iranians who see their own economic struggles and political frustrations reflected in the protests. The government's credibility has been eroded by years of unfulfilled promises and corruption scandals that have exposed the gap between revolutionary rhetoric and lived reality. When officials blame foreign interference for protests sparked by inflation and unemployment, citizens who cannot afford basic necessities find such explanations inadequate at best and insulting at worst. The international community has watched these developments with a mixture of concern, uncertainty, and calculation. Western governments that have long been at odds with the Iranian regime see the protests as vindication of their policies and pressure campaigns. Human rights organizations have documented abuses by security forces and called for restraint and accountability. Regional powers with their own interests in Iran's internal stability or instability have made various public statements while undoubtedly conducting private assessments of how the situation might affect their strategic positions. But for all the international attention, the story of these protests remains fundamentally Iranian. It is a story of people pushed beyond their limits by circumstances that have made daily life increasingly unbearable. It is a story of young people who see no future in the current system and older generations who remember past promises that went unfulfilled. It is a story of regional inequalities, of cities like Abdanan that feel abandoned by a central government focused elsewhere. It is a story of digital age activism that allows rapid information sharing despite government efforts at censorship. And it is a story whose ending remains unwritten. The tactics employed by protesters have evolved as the demonstrations have continued. Early protests were often spontaneous, erupting in response to specific triggers like price increases or arrests. As the movement has matured, greater organization has become evident, though it remains largely decentralized and leaderless in the traditional sense. Protesters have learned from past experiences, both their own and those of demonstrators in other countries. They have developed strategies for dealing with security forces, for communicating when internet access is restricted, and for maintaining momentum even as arrests thin their ranks. The role of women in these protests deserves particular attention. Iranian women have long been at the forefront of social activism, pushing against restrictions on their dress, movement, and participation in public life. In the current wave of protests, women are once again prominent, linking economic demands with calls for greater personal freedom and gender equality. Their presence and voices have given the protests a dimension that goes beyond immediate material concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the kind of society Iranians want to build. The ethnic and regional diversity of the protests also matters significantly. Iran is not a homogeneous nation, but rather a complex tapestry of Persian, Azeri, Kurdish, Arab, Baloch, and other communities, each with its own history and relationship to the central government. The protests have drawn participants from across these different groups, united by common economic struggles even as they bring distinct perspectives and grievances to the movement. This diversity strengthens the protests by giving them a truly national character, but it also complicates efforts at coordination and unified demands. Economic data provides stark illustration of the crisis facing ordinary Iranians. Unemployment figures, particularly among young people, paint a picture of wasted potential and frustrated ambitions. Youth unemployment in some estimates exceeds 40%, meaning that nearly half of young Iranians seeking work cannot find it. Even those with university degrees, once a reliable path to middle-class stability, struggle to find positions commensurate with their education. The brain drain of educated Iranians leaving for opportunities abroad has accelerated, depriving the country of talent it desperately needs. Food prices have become a particular flashpoint. Chicken, eggs, and bread, staples of the Iranian diet, have seen dramatic price increases that place them beyond the reach of many families. When people must choose between buying medicine and buying food, when parents skip meals so their children can eat, the social contract between government and governed begins to fray dangerously. The protests are in many ways a manifestation of that fraying, a public declaration that the current situation has become intolerable. The Iranian government faces difficult choices in how to respond to Abdanan and the broader protest movement. Heavy-handed crackdowns risk creating martyrs and generating greater resistance. Images of violence against protesters can go viral despite internet restrictions, generating international condemnation and internal anger. But showing weakness or willingness to negotiate might be seen by the regime as inviting greater challenges to its authority. This dilemma has paralyzed responses in the past and appears to be doing so again. Some analysts suggest that the regime might allow protests to continue for a time, calculating that they will eventually lose momentum as participants tire or are gradually arrested. This strategy of managed containment has worked before, particularly when protests remained focused on specific grievances that could be addressed through minor concessions or simply endured until exhaustion set in. But the current wave of protests, with its evolution from economic to political demands and its seizure of an entire city, suggests a level of determination that may not respond to such waiting games. The question of what comes next looms over every analysis of the current situation. Will Abdanan inspire similar takeovers in other cities, creating a cascade of government retreats that could threaten the regime's control? Or will security forces regroup and retake the city, possibly with violence that could become a defining moment in the protests one way or another? Will the government offer meaningful reforms that address at least some of the demonstrators' concerns, or will it double down on repression and blame external enemies? The protesters themselves have shown remarkable persistence in the face of significant risks. Being arrested in Iran can mean not just temporary detention, but long prison sentences, torture, and permanent marks on one's record that affect future employment and opportunities. The fact that people continue to take to the streets despite these dangers speaks to the depth of their desperation and determination. They are, in effect, betting that change is possible if enough people are willing to demand it and bear the costs of that demand. Inside Iran, ordinary citizens are making daily calculations about their own safety and involvement. Many who sympathize with the protesters' demands nonetheless stay home, fearful of arrest or violence, worried about their families and livelihoods. Others find themselves pulled into the movement almost despite themselves, their anger overcoming their caution. The dynamics of collective action are always complex, involving individual risk assessment combined with perception of the movement's chances of success and one's moral obligation to participate. The historical echoes of previous protest movements in Iran cannot be ignored. The 1979 revolution that brought the current system to power was itself fueled by economic grievances, social restrictions, and political repression under the Shah's regime. The Green Movement protests of 2009, sparked by disputed election results, demonstrated the population's willingness to challenge the system despite brutal repression. More recent protests in 2017 and 2019 showed that economic pressures could still bring people into the streets in large numbers. Each of these precedents informs how both protesters and the government approach the current situation. What distinguishes the current protests in some ways is their geographic spread and their ability to persist despite lacking clear leadership or organizational structure. The decentralized nature makes the movement more resilient to targeted crackdowns, but also potentially less able to negotiate or consolidate gains. It is a double-edged characteristic that reflects both the strengths and limitations of spontaneous popular uprising in the digital age. The city of Abdanan itself, in the midst of all this analysis and context, remains under the control of its citizens at this moment. What daily life looks like in a city that has effectively declared independence from government authority is difficult to determine from the outside. Are basic services functioning? How are protesters maintaining order and making decisions about what comes next? What discussions are happening about demands, tactics, and ultimate goals? These questions remain largely unanswered in the available reporting, but the answers matter greatly for understanding whether Abdanan represents a brief anomaly or the beginning of a fundamental shift. The symbolism of Abdanan's seizure extends beyond its immediate practical implications. It represents a breakdown of the social order that the Islamic Republic has maintained for over 40 years. It suggests that the government's security apparatus, while still formidable in many ways, may not be as omnipresent or as committed as previously thought. It raises questions about the loyalty of security forces, particularly in smaller cities and among lower-ranking personnel who may themselves be struggling with the same economic pressures as the protesters they are ordered to confront. For Iran's neighbors and the wider international community, the developments in Abdanan and across Iran present both opportunities and risks. Instability in Iran could affect regional security dynamics, oil markets, and various ongoing conflicts and tensions. Different actors have different preferences about Iran's future, ranging from hopes for democratic reform to desires for regime collapse to concerns about chaos and its unpredictable consequences. These varying interests shape how different governments respond to and discuss the protests. The humanitarian dimension of the protests deserves continued attention. Behind the strategic analyses and political calculations are real people experiencing real suffering. Families are grieving for loved ones killed or imprisoned. Individuals are nursing wounds from clashes with security forces. Communities are grappling with shortages of food and medicine, while also confronting the breakdown of normal social order. Any assessment of these events that loses sight of this human cost is incomplete and inadequate. As the situation continues to evolve, certain indicators will be worth watching closely. The government's ability or inability to retake Abdanan will send important signals about the balance of power. The spread or containment of similar incidents in other cities will indicate whether Abdanan was unique or representative. The level of violence employed by security forces and the casualties resulting from confrontations will affect both domestic and international perceptions, and the endurance or exhaustion of the protest movement over time will determine whether this moment is remembered as a turning point or another chapter in Iran's long history of popular dissatisfaction and state control. The technological dimension of modern protests continues to play a crucial role in Iran's current unrest. Despite government efforts to restrict internet access and block social media platforms, information continues to flow both within Iran and to the outside world. Protesters use virtual private networks and other tools to circumvent censorship. Videos are filmed and shared, creating a record of events that the government cannot fully control or suppress. This technological cat and mouse game has become a defining feature of 21st century protest movements, and Iran is no exception. The economic foundations of the regime itself face questioning in ways that go beyond immediate price increases or unemployment figures. The structure of Iran's economy, with large sectors controlled by quasi-governmental organizations and foundations, has created opportunities for corruption and inefficiency while limiting competition and innovation. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps controls vast economic holdings that give it both financial power and vested interest in maintaining the current system. Reforming such an economy would require challenging powerful interests that benefit from the status quo, making meaningful change difficult even if political will existed. International sanctions, whatever their intended purpose, have undeniable effects on ordinary Iranians that contribute to the conditions fueling protests. While sanctions target the government and specific sectors, their impact ripples through the entire economy. Medicine becomes harder to obtain, even though technically exempted, because banking restrictions complicate payment and shipping. Businesses cannot access equipment or technology they need. The currency collapse that makes everything more expensive is partly driven by sanctions effects on Iran's oil exports and foreign exchange earnings. This reality complicates narratives on all sides about who bears responsibility for Iran's economic crisis. The role of Iran's reformist political faction, such as it exists within the current system, has been largely absent from these street protests. Previous waves of unrest sometimes had connections to reformist politicians who sought to channel public anger into pressure for change within the existing constitutional framework. The current protests appear more disconnected from elite politics, suggesting either that protesters have lost faith in reform from within, or that the political space for such reform has narrowed to the point of irrelevance. This disconnect between street-level activism and institutional politics is itself significant. As night falls over Abdanan and rises again on another day of uncertainty, the city's seizure by protesters stands as a potent symbol of a nation in crisis. Whether this symbol becomes a beacon inspiring further challenges to authority or a cautionary tale of overreach and inevitable crackdown remains to be seen. What is certain is that the underlying conditions that brought people into the streets, the economic desperation and political frustration, have not been addressed. Until they are, the potential for further unrest remains very real. The current situation in Abdanan represents an unprecedented challenge to Iranian government control, with the city remaining under protester control following the withdrawal of security forces amid nationwide economic demonstrations that have escalated into political demands. This script draws on social media reports, opposition source accounts, and mainstream news coverage of Iran's protest movements and economic crisis.